Very simply, are you a Nova Scotian first or a Tory first?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm a Nova Scotian that was part of a government that got the offshore accord for the people of this province, Mr. Speaker. I'm a Nova Scotian who will stand up to Ottawa on this issue, I can assure you, Mr. Speaker. I am a Nova Scotian who will not do what the previous Liberal government did, who didn't fight for the rights of Nova Scotians. I will fight for them, Mr. Speaker. I will stand with this government. I will stand with Nova Scotians until Nova Scotians get what they rightfully deserve.
The honourable member from Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr.
Order,
Speaker.
please. Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member from Pictou West has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question through you is to the Minister of Transportation and Public Works. Mr. Speaker, the saga of the Mooseland Road continues. Residents along this road are worried and have great concern for their safety. The asphalt and roadbed continue to deteriorate, and the only work they're able to secure from government is a menagerie of patchwork. Local resident William Preston said what is really needed to make the road safe is a long-term plan to have the road bed and the pavement repaired. Local people know that it can't be done in a single year, but what they really want is a plan to repair the bed, not yearly patch jobs. So my question through you to the Minister, when will he bring forward a plan to make the needed repairs on the Mooseland Road?
Thank you. The Honourable the Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the honourable member making a plea on behalf of an area of the province side of Pictou West, and I'm glad to see that he's prepared to see needs that are required elsewhere. And Mr. Speaker, we do attempt to address work all over the province. I'm fully aware of the concerns of the residents and those who use the Mooseland Road. And the honourable member also appreciates that we're dealing with limited funds, and we do address priorities on a year-by-year basis. And if the honourable member wants to offer up some of his work for the Mooseland Road, we'll take it under consideration.
The honourable member from Pictou West on his first supplementary.
Okay. Well, Mr. Speaker, we all know, yes, that funds are tight and there's not a lot of money around these days from this government for paving. But what is really bothering the people on the Mooseland Road and other roads like it throughout Nova Scotia is that there's complete lack of a strategic plan when it comes to making repairs. Mooseland Road has been promised remedial work, but taking the money and using it for simply patching is not enough. It's not a wise investment. The bed beneath the road is shot and is in need of repairs. So my question to the Minister again, why won't he make a wise and strategic investment and repair the bed so the same holes will not have to be patched again next year?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as I indicated to the honourable member, we do assess roads, and we do have priorities with respect to addressing those roads. The condition of the Mooseland Road is something with which we are familiar, and when funds become available, Mr. Speaker, we will address the deficiencies on that road.
The honourable member from Pictou West on your final question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, if residents on roads like this could look at a long-term plan that would show them an end result where they would have safe roads to drive on, roads where they didn't have to ride on the opposite side of the road just to get past the rough spots, or where they would have a road where potholes didn't take money out of their pockets for repairs, or where they could see a plan and trace its progress year by year. So my question, why is this government unwilling to create a long-term plan that would make wise investments in our secondary roads?
Thank you. The Honourable the Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, we do in fact have a plan with respect to addressing the needs of all roads throughout the province. And with respect to the Mooseland Road, I can tell the honourable member that the member for Guysborough Sheet Harbour and myself will be travelling that road later this spring, and that, of course, will form part of our assessment of the needs on that road.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister responsible for the Human Rights Commission. The Nova Scotia Human Rights Act presently prohibits discrimination by those renting or selling housing on the basis of age. While discrimination clearly ought to be prevented in our society, the broad application of the Act actually prohibits the construction of condo and apartment developments specifically targeting our aging population. So my question to the Minister, why does the Human Rights Act continue to prohibit seniors' condos or apartment developments?
The honourable minister responsible for the Human Rights Commission.
True, is it? What? Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll certainly take that question under advisement, but I would have to. I'd like to determine whether, in fact, that's true or not, Mr. Speaker. I think that there may be an opportunity for that type of complaint to be followed through by the Human Rights, but I will certainly take it under advisement and report back to the honourable member.
Thank you. The honourable member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, other provinces in Canada allow 55 and older housing developments in the private sector. New Brunswick, British Columbia, Newfoundland and Labrador, Alberta and Saskatchewan all have legislation that enables designated seniors housing. Now, we have a growing population of baby boomers who would like to sell their homes for something more accessible in a senior-friendly environment. Changes to the Human Rights Act are required before such developments can happen in Nova Scotia. So my question to the Minister, why can't this province investigate the changes necessary to provide this choice in our aging population?
The honourable Minister responsible for the Human Rights Act.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I said earlier, I believe that the issue the honourable members bringing forward is a very important issue. But, Mr. Speaker, I think it's a matter of interpretation of that very section. But I will undertake, Mr. Speaker, to review that and report that to the member.
Good, ma'am. Thank you. The honourable member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley on your final question.
Well, I appreciate that, Mr. Speaker, because certainly the construction industry in Nova Scotia believes that the interpretation given to them is that this is not allowed in Nova Scotia, so it certainly is worth investigating. I want to be clear that nobody is advocating that landlords be allowed to refuse to rent or sell to families under normal circumstances. However, other jurisdictions have found a way to balance human rights issues with a market demand for specialized, accessible, and secure seniors housing. So my question to the Minister, will he commit to reviewing our legislation compared to other provinces that allow seniors-only housing developments?
The honourable Minister responsible for the Human Rights Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes.
Thank you. The honourable the member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Health Promotion and Protection. Mr. Speaker, last week the Public Accounts Committee members heard from the Deputy Minister of Health Promotion and stated on several occasions that the primary reason for the 2014 Commonwealth Games budget that ran out of cost control and the province could not afford the Games was because the criteria for the stadiums and complex had changed midstream to Olympic standards. However, the bid committee CEO this morning told the committee that the criteria had not changed. My question to the minister is the minister, which is it?
The honourable Minister for Health Promotion and Protection.
Let me, Mr. Speaker, let me answer the member's question this way. The primary reason that this government did not move forward with the Commonwealth Games is cost. We believe it's irresponsible to spend $1.7 billion to support a Games that initially we were under the impression that would cost $785 million. The member opposite thinks that it's appropriate. Let him explain that to his constituents, but for our sake, we believe that it's appropriate to make the decision. It was appropriate to make the decision we did based on the fiscal capacity of this province, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Preston on your first supplementary.
Well, I'm going to ask the question again of the minister. It was clear this morning that the CEO of the Games Committee clearly stated under several questions of the same question what changed the bid. And he said it had nothing to do with the criteria. And it was, but a week before, the Deputy Minister had said that was the reason, the total reason for the cost increase of almost $1 billion. There seems to be a disconnect between government and the committee. So could the Minister describe to us now why there was this disconnect, and was this disconnect on a regular basis, and did the government really know what was going on with this whole bid process?
The Honourable the Minister of Health, Promotion and Protection.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll say to the member opposite and to all Nova Scotians, there may be a disconnect, but what there isn't a disconnect in is the fact that the estimates were $785 million to host these games. The cost came in at $1.7 billion. We weren't prepared to risk the financial stability of this province. That's why we made the decision we made, and I believe it's the right decision, and Nova Scotians support us for making that decision, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Preston on your final question.
Well, I can tell you the taxpayers of this province are very disappointed of the over $7 million it took this government to figure out that it was going to cost too much for the people in this province to pay for. You should have figured that out before you spent the $7+ million, maybe as high as $10 million. Money that could have gone to other functions in this province, badly needed roads, recreational facilities, and other things in the province that really are needed by the taxpayers. We've been embarrassed. We've embarrassed the city, we've embarrassed this province, and we've embarrassed our country by moving forward with this and not being properly prepared. My question to the Minister is, do you now regret the lack of intention and intervention from yourself and the Premier to ensure the success of the bid of these games and to follow the affordability of the games before it was realized that it was $1.7 billion that the taxpayers would have to pay, and they already had paid $7 to $10 million to figure that out?
Thank you. The Honourable the Minister of Health, Promotion and Protection.
First of all, Mr. Speaker, let me correct the honourable member with some of his figures. In fact, the province's contribution was only $3.5 million to the bid process, of which we believe it all hasn't been spent. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, the fundamental question here is, would we rather be embarrassed or broke? And I would choose embarrassed. In fact, I'm not embarrassed, but we didn't believe it was appropriate to risk the financial stability of this province to spend $1.7 billion on a games with significant risks identified to us through a number of reports, Mr. Speaker. It's a decision that I understand the majority of Nova Scotians support. It's a decision I think this government is very proud of, Mr. Speaker. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member doesn't point out today that moving forward with hosting these games was a unanimous decision of this House of Assembly, not just this government. So there is some level of support on that side that has to be considered as well, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Energy. You know, the Electricity Market Governance Committee report has sat on various ministers of energy's desks with really nothing done on it, Mr. Speaker. And the renewable energy industry sector is waiting for action from this government on this, and they've been fairly silent on it. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Minister of Energy, why have you not introduced feed-in tariffs and other measures to grow the renewable energy sector in this province?
The Honourable the Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to stand in my place today and announce to the House that this government's initiatives to move forward on the electricity file has been very aggressive. I have answered the questions for the member in the estimates, and I'll stand here in my place that we have proceeded with a number of initiatives to move towards a greener and cleaner Nova Scotia in regards to renewables. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Cape Breton Centre on your first supplementary.
The MGC he ignores, but he's moving forward. Mr. Speaker, this minister is twisted and turned in the wind when it was blowing on renewable energy, Mr. Speaker. First he says he's in favour of a big increase in renewable energy, then he says he's not. So, Mr. Speaker, coming out of the EMGC, there was an energy bill. I want to ask this minister, where is his energy bill?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Yes, I'm going to say it. Frankly speaking, Mr. Speaker, frankly speaking, 20% of renewables in the mix by 2013. The municipal utilities are permitted to buy green energy from independent power producers. Mr. Speaker, we have permitted through the Utility and Review Board the usage of the grid. We are now, Mr. Speaker, moving towards top up and spill, Mr. Speaker, for the renewable energy family and community. Mr. Speaker, I stand in my place and say that we have moved and are still continuing to move aggressively to a cleaner and greener Nova Scotia under the direction of our Premier. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre on your final question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, he stands in his place and says that he's for a greenable and a more sustainable future for this province and by his Premier. But last week, Mr. Speaker, in estimates, he told me that he was personally against standard offer contracts and would not move forward on them. So he's allowing his personal bias to stand in the way of small renewable companies in rural Nova Scotia getting involved. So I want to ask the minister to explain to us why he refuses to introduce feed-in tariffs to generate community-based wind energy sectors for the good of rural Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, we're not in the business to dictate the price that ratepayers in Nova Scotia should pay for kilowatt hours. Mr. Speaker, there's a mechanism in place called the Utility and Review Board. And that mechanism, Mr. Speaker, has proven successful as a caretaker of the ratepayers of Nova Scotia. Thank you.
The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, post-secondary education is extremely important to the future success of our province. Yet year after year, hundreds of bright young Nova Scotians are forced to leave this province in order to obtain teaching degrees. Mr. Speaker, with a teaching shortage looming in this province, it's time that the government takes responsibility for its inaction and finally addresses the need for more Bachelor of Education program spaces. So my question to the Minister is, what is the Minister's plan to increase the number of enrolment spaces for Nova Scotia's Bachelor of Education programs?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, to the member opposite, I appreciate the question, and I want to remind the member and all members of the House that teacher education, teacher certification is the another area that I've called for a review. That review will begin in this month of April with a report due to me in November, and that review will be looking at where we deliver our BED programs, the duration of those programs, the composition of those programs, because we recognize that we have a need in our province for teachers, and we want to look at how we can meet that need in the most efficient way.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we all know that this province has among the finest post-secondary institutions in the country, and several of those institutions currently have two-year Bachelor of Education programs. But, Mr. Speaker, many of the institutions turn away students because of limited capacity. Mr. Speaker, there are other institutions, such as Cape Breton University, that are interested in providing teacher education. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the post-Shapiro review of teacher education recommended that the minister establish a committee proposing any future policy changes with respect to teacher education programs, and that CBU should be included as one of the institutions interested in teacher professional development. So my question to the minister, Mr. Speaker, will the minister listen to that recommendation made by the post-Shapiro review and include Cape Breton University in any future discussions surrounding teacher professional development?
Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, to the member opposite, the review that is being conducted will include review consultation with all of the universities in the province, but I have made the statement publicly and I will make it again. I do not believe that Nova Scotia students who wish to have a BED program should have to leave the province to get that.
The honourable member from Glace Bay on your final question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the 2004-2005 school year, there have been about 600 teacher retirements. That means 1 in 6 teachers have retired over the past 2 years alone. Mr. Speaker, not only does Cape Breton University have the ability to provide teacher education so that Nova Scotians aren't forced to leave the province, it can also help deal with teacher shortages that the province is currently facing. Mr. Speaker, if Bachelor of Education programs are not provided in other Nova Scotia institutions, then students will continue to leave the province and possibly they'll leave permanently. Mr. Speaker, my final question for the Minister is, will the Minister implement the recommendations made by the Shapiro report and increase the number of institutions offering Bachelor of Education programs?
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the report and recommendations that come out of the review committee's work, and I will not prejudge what that will be, but I have made it very clear in the terms of reference that one of the things that should be looked at is where we provide that teacher training program in the province to make sure that we do meet the needs of those students who want to study in Nova Scotia and that we are geographically kind to those students in our province.
Thank you. The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my question is for the Minister of Community Services. I've been speaking with a young mother who lives in Harrietsfield, where there is no bus, and works in Dartmouth. Her daughters go to school in Harrietsfield, of course, and while she is at work, they require lunch and after-school care. Her income qualifies her for a portable childcare subsidy. Unfortunately, this subsidy is absolutely worthless to this family because there are no licensed childcare facilities in the area. My question to the Minister is, when in the 10-year plan will there be licensed childcare facility where it's needed and established in the Harrietsfield area so there is in fact a use for the portable subsidies offered?
Thank you. The Honourable the Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. To my honourable colleague, the plan that Nova Scotia has put into place after consultation with stakeholders, with the industry, with parents, Mr. Speaker, is a plan that is a solid plan. We build it in the first 5 years, Mr. Speaker. We get it on the ground. We make those spaces available to parents. We make the industry stronger, Mr. Speaker, with the investments that we've made. As we do that, Mr. Speaker, we sustain the plan for the duration of 10 years and beyond, Mr. Speaker. And as we move forward with the plan, we will have it unfold across the province, Mr. Speaker, in a well-thought-out, well-planned manner, Mr. Speaker, so that all of the areas of the province, Mr. Speaker, and the challenges they face with childcare can be addressed, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can't help finding it very telling that the Minister refers to childcare as an industry. Childcare is needed where there are children. It has nothing to do with industry. There was, however, licensed childcare at an affordable rate in the Riverview daycare in the Spryfield area until a couple of years ago when it was allowed to go. Mr. Speaker, these children logistically cannot leave the community to go to a licensed childcare facility. The lack of licensed childcare facility in the area means that many families just plain can't get their children to any sort of childcare facility at an affordable price, and they are left with very difficult choices to make. My question, what use is a portable childcare subsidy without a childcare facility to use it in?
The Honourable the Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to my honourable colleague across the way, portability is a very serious issue, Mr. Speaker. It's one that we want to ensure that those subsidized spaces are available, Mr. Speaker, for families, for indeed it is the choice in quality childcare that is so extremely important, Mr. Speaker. And I know that my honourable colleague will be interested to know that the family home daycare rollout, Mr. Speaker, component of the 10-year plan will be any day now, Mr. Speaker, and we will be able to provide those opportunities all across the province, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, I hope areas like my honourable colleagues will take advantage of this very exciting new component and part of the 10-year plan, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Halifax Atlantic on your final question.
Speaker, I appreciate this. But without ensuring that there is, in fact, funding available for childcare facilities, I hope that the Minister will be able to guarantee that there are facilities. Many Nova Scotians are unable to work because legally they cannot leave their children at home alone, even if they chose to do so. Without core funding, many child care facilities cannot survive. Core funding used to be provided in the form of allocated, guaranteed subsidies. This meant that places were available within the communities where they were needed. I do not know, and I hope that the minister can tell me, whether or not there will in fact be reliable funding for licensed child care facility in all the communities where there are children. My question, what is your government doing to ensure that there is licensed child care available for the children who need them, where they need them, and that this child care facility does not simply disappear, taking with it the worthless portable subsidies?
Thank you. The Honourable the Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order, please. The time allotted for our question period has now expired. The Honourable the House Leader for the Liberal Party.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill 51?
Bill number 51. The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly pleased today to rise and speak on Bill 51. Oh.
On an introduction, the member will yield the floor. Thank you. The Honourable the Premier on introduction.
Thank you very much. I'll be very quick, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to draw the member's attention to the East Gallery. A couple of guests with us here today. The Mayor of Cancel, a former member of this Legislative Assembly, Mr. Ray White, welcome here to the Assembly, as well as the Warden of my own area, Municipality of Inverness, Mr. Stuart McCauley, who's also the Councillor of the Cogmary. So welcome here to the Legislature here today.
Thank you. The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and certainly pleased today to rise and speak on Bill 51. And this bill was introduced now for the second time, which is to work to get compensation for the Spring Hill miners' widows, as well as widows from industrial accidents in the province of Nova Scotia. The Supreme Court of Canada upheld the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and extended it to prohibit discrimination on the basis of marital status. And this was a landmark decision by the Supreme Court, of course, which was really part of an extension of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And in relatively short order, British Columbia, Ontario moved to compensate their widows. And just last year, Newfoundland also took the steps to provide the compensation that they felt was just and right for these widows. Now, the government of Nova Scotia made it clear that because their spouses died before 1985 and they remarried, the government, in effect, considered them non-existent. And as a result, those that remarried lost the small amount of compensation or survivors' benefits that they were receiving after, in particular, mine disasters in Spring Hill, and also a smaller number in Cape Breton who were affected by such industrial accidents. So these widows who remarried ended up losing even the small amount that could have helped them, and especially many left with young families, large families, and of course it put a huge burden on them. Now, many would ask the question, and I know it was asked in this legislature many years ago, what's the difference between a spouse's death before 1985 and one who died after that year? and it's an obvious one that in many ways both the legislature and the courts for a period of time had not adequately dealt with. Now, the widows of Spring Hill miners and industrial accident victims, they actually won their case in the Nova Scotia Supreme Court. They felt that they were entitled to compensation, and they hired a lawyer, and they took the case to the Supreme Court, and of course they were able to put a substantial amount of evidence forward, which in fact led to a Supreme Court decision in their favor. And of course, you know, they celebrated this victory, and because many now were about to see their quality of life improve. During the period of the trial, you know, many of the widows who came forward told their stories, and there were many stories of desperation that were presented. Many who were left with large families, some who remarried, and the second marriage, you know, did not work out, and as a result, their quality of life certainly was a pretty desperate one, without adequate income to look after children and really to look after themselves. And when the case was won, you know, widows actually were notified of how much they would receive, and you know, this was going to be a time of significant improvement for their personal lives. The homes they lived in could be upgraded. However, in 1999, Premier Ham of today appealed the workers' compensation benefits, and during that time is when we heard from people like Margaret MacLeod, who came forward to tell what was in many cases heartbreaking stories of what they had lived through from the time of the industrial accident to 1999, when their case went before the appeal board and again was upheld in favor of the province. So the widows were so close to being compensated, and once again, you know, 30 years in many cases after the fact. We were looking at 1956, I think about 50 years ago, the Spring Hill mining disaster occurred, and so many had this long fight for compensation, had won their case, and now the province appealed and they lost out. I mentioned Margaret MacLeod of New Waterford a few moments ago, and she was one of the people that came forward with her story, and she told of you know, trying to raise her 9 children from 6 months to 17 years of age, first on her own, then she remarried and was divorced in 1983. So for about you know, almost 20 years up to 1999. She had lived with very limited income, in fact, a very inadequate income, and again, this was impacting on many of these widows in all aspects of their lives. And what really I think you know is the heart of this story, and the reason that you know, I brought it forth was meeting one of the widows who now has retired to my area after remarrying a member of the Canadian Armed Forces. And Shirley Shore was the person who came forward and you know, gave her story last year to the Daily News when this bill was first introduced. And their stories are ones that this compensation They deserved it. It was compensation that was rightfully theirs, and of course the court proved that it was a just compensation. So that's what I found very compelling about bringing forth a bill that I felt was one that was going to address this issue. And now, of course, they're probably down to about 50 widows. When this whole ordeal started out, there was about 120 widows that were looking for some compensation. And so today, their fight remains. And essentially now, it's fighting for the missed benefits from 1985 to 1999. That's the period of time, 14 years, in which the post-charter period, that they should have received a lump sum payment for the survivors' benefits that they lost after they remarried. So we have it from the Supreme Court of Canada that if you remarried, you shouldn't be discriminated against, but yet they really lost out on that account because they had 14 years in which they received no benefits. From 1999 on, when the case was won, they did gain a small compensation from that point forward. So the case remains today one where people like Shirley Shore, Betty Bauman, and Margaret MacLeod, and probably about 50 others still engage in this whole wonderment of what they can do next. And they have looked to the Nova Scotia legislature to support their cause. They have approached all three parties to once again look into a way, whether it's through legislation, whether it's through MLAs supporting them, through the Workmen's Compensation Board, to have their case again go through a review. They certainly don't seem to be in a position to take their case to the Supreme Court of Canada, so it's only natural that they would look to us as MLAs to bring justice to their case. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I will take my place.
Thank you. The Honourable, the Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me time to speak to this very important issue. This government is committed to protecting the rights of workers and their families. So when an employee is injured or, worse yet, killed on the job in Nova Scotia, we know as a province we have an obligation to ensure that victims and their families are taken care of. And thus we have in Nova Scotia the Workers' Compensation Board that helps us protect workers and their families. As you know, the Workers' Compensation Board in Nova Scotia is funded entirely by the employers within Nova Scotia. The WCB provides workplace insurance for more than 18,000 employers, representing about 300,000 employees and workers across the province. And Mr. Speaker, the issue of widows seeking additional compensation from WCB is one that I have looked long and hard at. As a government, we want to ensure that Nova Scotians get all they're entitled to, especially if a worker was injured or lost their life on the job. Now, the history behind the reinstating of benefits for widows is one that's complex and somewhat difficult to understand. In June 1998, the Select Committee on the Workers' Compensation Act was established. The committee was made up of 9 members from 3 political parties and 4 consultants representing the interests of injured workers, the business, the legal, and the medical communities. The mandate of that Select Committee in 1998 was to review changes to the Workers' Compensation Act. The process entailed asking Nova Scotians for their ideas on how to make the current system a better one. And the response from Nova Scotians, as you can imagine, Mr. Speaker, was overwhelming. In all, the committee heard from 174 presenters at the public hearings, and additional 90 written submissions were received as well. So in 1999, that select committee issued their report, and it dealt with the issue, Mr. Speaker, of survivor benefits. On October 1st, going back in time, as you know, legislation was enacted to permanently protect survivor benefits for spouses who decided to remarry after 1992. But prior to this date, widows and widowers who remarried had their survivor benefits permanently discontinued. In 1985, the equality provisions of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms became the law which provides equal protection and benefits of the law without discrimination. The former Workers' Compensation Act was amended in 1992 to reflect this and to ensure that widows and widowers would no longer have their benefits discontinued upon remarriage. So after hearing from Nova Scotians on the Select Committee, the committee recommended reinstating survivor benefits for all widows and all widowers who remarried prior to October 1st, 1992 and had their benefits terminated under the previous legislation. So after that report was released by the committee, this legislature passed Bill 90. Bill 90, Mr. Speaker, allowed then for the reinstatement of survivor benefits for both pre-charter and post-charter cases. But in both cases, the reinstatement dates would be different. For post-charter cases, widows had their benefits restored to the day they were unfairly ended. In the case of pre-charter payments, Mr. Speaker, they were considered ex gratia. Ex gratia means that there was no legal obligation to reinstate survivor benefits to this group. But although there was no legal obligation to reinstate pre-charter survivor benefits, it was considered by the government of Nova Scotia the right thing to do. Therefore, it was decided, Mr. Speaker, that widows whose benefits had been stopped because they remarried prior to the implementation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms would have their survivor benefits reinstated effective January 1st, 1999. Not only were their benefits reinstated, Mr. Speaker, but all widows were guaranteed payment for life. Now, in 2001, the Minister of Labour, who I believe at that time was my colleague from King South, publicly announced a new offer for the widows. The offer announced was similar to that made in Manitoba, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. The offer, Mr. Speaker, would be a one-time payment of $80,000 per person, or a continuation of the widow's monthly survivor benefit of approximately $750 per month. The Minister of Labour at that time wanted to ensure that the widows in Nova Scotia were given the same offer as their counterparts in these other Canadian provinces I mentioned. Now, the widows group received the offer but rejected it and continued with their plan for a lawsuit. That lawsuit was later rejected for appeal by the Supreme Court of Canada. Mr. Speaker, allow me to give you some more statistics that I think are interesting. The widows receive approximately $9,000 per year in survivor benefits. So in January 2008, the widows will have received, on average, more than the widows in the other provinces who took the lump sum of $80,000. And they will continue to receive this monthly benefit for the rest of their lives. In Newfoundland, where the offshore economy continues to grow, the government recently decided to reinstate benefits to the pre-charter widows from the date the charter took effect. So in light of this decision by Newfoundland, Mr. Speaker, I asked the new stakeholder board of directors of the WCB to review this issue in Nova Scotia. Upon careful review, Mr. Speaker, the board came to the same conclusion last year that they did in 1999. Though it's a difficult decision to make, and I'm sure it was difficult on their part to make, the board decided that it had to live within its means. This independent board is made up of representatives of labour, injured workers, and employers from across the province. The board works together to consider the impacts on the system before they make any decisions. The board estimated that to reinstate the widows' pensions to 1985 would cost over $10 million. And unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the board also logically came to the conclusion that this would come at the expense of today's employers, not the employers that existed 25 years ago. So this was, again, the advice of the Workers' Compensation Board to me after carefully reviewing it. Further to that, Mr. Speaker, at the urging for the member for for Inverness and the member for Antigonish. I met with the widows up in Cape Breton to speak to them personally and to try and explain to them the situation, which they already well knew, Mr. Speaker. We had a very frank meeting, a good meeting. I shared with them the fact that the Workers' Compensation Board was now a board that had a new governance structure, that it had 4 employers and 4 employees, and that while I would be happy and was happy to ask them to review this and to encourage them to review this, that in their wisdom they had done so and upheld the decision they made in 1999. They wrote back to me as well at that time, Mr. Speaker, when I asked for that initial response with a copy of the Supreme Court decision which upheld the decision they had made back in 1999. I realize that the widows, Mr. Speaker, are not satisfied with this. I feel that there'll be no way I can ever explain to them fully in a way that they'll accept this. And if I were in their shoes, I would probably take the same position they do. However, Mr. Speaker, we have been, when you look at it in financial terms, we have been far more generous with the system that's here in Nova Scotia than the system that was done in other provinces. As I stated before, Mr. Speaker, by next year, the widows will have received almost $80,000, which is more than $80,000 actually, which is more than the lump sum payments in those 5 other provinces, and will continue to receive that amount. So, depending upon the lifetime of the widows, it's possible that they could receive double what the other provinces give. This is a very generous offer then, Mr. Speaker, and I think it's to be commended to the Minister of Labour at that time that he saw it. And I know he saw it very hard because I was in the same caucus with him, and he's a neighbour of mine, the member from King South, and he saw it very hard to be as fair as he could and to work with the Workers' Compensation Board to be as fair as they could with these widows. Mr. Speaker, the meeting was a bit of an emotional one for both of us, not simply because of this issue, but because we talked also about what it was like to lose a spouse. And certainly I understand that, having lost my spouse in 1999 from a sudden death that's still unexplained. And we shared together the difficulties and the problems that arise, and also the difficulties that arise financially. And that is something, of course, that is of concern. And I know that's what weighed on the mind of the Minister of Labour at that time, my colleague, the Honourable David Morris, or the member for Kings South, sorry. And I know it weighed on my mind when I asked the Workers' Compensation Board to take a look at this again, to see if there was any way in which there was a possibility of providing extra money to those widows. And in their response to me, they pointed out quite clearly that actually the widows in Nova Scotia were far better off than widows across Canada in most other provinces, and that they had been exceedingly generous, and that the widows in our province, as I said, are already now at the level where they have as much money as those other provinces gave, and will continue month by month by month by month to receive more income. So, Mr. Speaker, in light of the financial implications to the Workers' Compensation Board, in light of the independent governance structure that we set up, and in light of the fact that there's a cogent case that our method, our system, is actually more generous than these other provinces that I mentioned, it seemed to me at the time that it was best to accept the wisdom of the Workers' Compensation Board in their decision, Mr. Speaker. However, I continue to respond to the widows group. I know that there are members in the caucus. I've mentioned 2 members who've spoken to me about it. And when the Premier and Deputy Premier speak to you, you do listen, I assure you, Mr. Speaker, and you look at the issue thoroughly in order to make sure that fairness and compassion come into play. And that's really what tried to underline the decision made by my colleague, the member for King South, and my recent request for fairness and compassion. And Mr. Speaker, while the widows, I'm sure, will not agree with me, I do think we have reached a balance of fairness and compassion.
Thank you. The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to say in the outset here that myself and our party do support Bill 51, and but I must get into the idea, first of all, that the party that brought this forward could have rectified this in in 94 legislation, again in the 99 legislation. I also want to react to the point of view of the all-party committee on WCB, and as many would know, that all-party committee documents are often documents of some compromise and being signed off but really you just can't look at that document and say that's where the infamous Bill 90 came from, because there was some take of that was clearly watered down. If one would only have to look at another recommendation, that every employer in the province become a stakeholder in WCB, which is not the case. That they would pay premiums, but that was not that while it was agreed upon in the report, certainly wasn't reflected in the legislation, Mr. Speaker. So we come up with could the third party have done it right? Yes, they had a couple of times to right the wrong and didn't. Now, to take on what the minister has said and spoke ad nauseum about the fairness and the amount of money that these widows take as proportion to other provinces. Well, it's one to say that, well, we underpay them and we undervalue them, but we don't undervalue them as much as other provinces. It's just not a reasoned argument, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that when the minister speaks of employers today that pay into the fund should not be brought into and made paid for sins of the past, if you will, Mr. Speaker, does not carry one drop of water. If we want to go back to the origins of WCB in this country and using the Meredith principle, there are certain rights that workers gave up, and indeed gave up on behalf of their families, and one is that right one would call inalienable, the one to sue over a workplace accident, or a workplace accident, even worse, causing death. So what we got here, Mr. Speaker, is a group predominantly females. There are a few males involved, but the predominantly females who had seen the loss of their spouse through a workplace accident, and upon remarrying had lost their benefits. Now, we've got to ask ourselves one important question. Is it fair? I don't think we ask ourselves the question, is it legal? But the question we must ask, is it fair? Now, the group took this forward on a fairness issue. They did not take it forward in reality to find out if it would hold up in court. They felt that outside of probably the battlefield, that their spouse paid the ultimate sacrifice, and that's losing their life in the workplace. And this was happened because, again, if you look at the Meredith principle, there's no blame to be apportioned. So these folks go out there, get a benefit, and then lose that benefit because they decide to remarry somewhere down the road. Now, we've all come to agree that this is not fair. The Charter says it's not fair, and indeed the Supreme Court, interpreting the Charter, says this is not fair. So what do we do? Do we ignore what the courts have said because it's going to cost the insurance plan, better known as the Workers' Compensation Board, money? Well, I don't think that's the overriding rule. Yes, you have to be conscious of the money you spend, but you are in an insurance scheme. And if something that's appropriate to be paid should be paid, And I say that this is an appropriate payment. That the Charter clearly recognized this as a fault. Therefore, we should pay these people. To merely state that this would have a financial impact on the board is wrong. I mean, if there was a cataclysmic event tomorrow and it had a disastrous financial effect on the board is still obligated to pay. The board was obligated to pay when it made a misstep, a large misstep around chronic pain, and it had to owe up to it. Now, there's an argument there to say their prescription around this, and they put false fences around the description of chronic pain, is an argument for, I would say, another bill another day, Mr. Speaker. But nonetheless, the fact of the matter is that there was a large payment associated with that, and that was due to the negligence of the board. And the reality is that we cannot only look at, because of the Meredith principle, we cannot only look at the board as an insurance scheme. I think by the mere fact that workers and their family have given away the right to pursue their employer over a workplace accident or workplace death, it's more than just an insurance scheme. It is, and I say by some interpretations, a social plan. Because what we've said is we're going to bind this, and to say that workers, employers fully fund this program is their responsibility. And their responsibility is, in the event of a workplace accident or worse, a death, that those benefits must be paid. But I don't think it's the purpose of this legislature to actually protect the accident fund of WCB. Our position as legislators should make sure that there's no wrongs committed. And I believe that there's been a wrong and injustice committed to these survivors. That clearly we should look at this and say that these folks did not do anything wrong, that they did everything in their power to do the right thing. I mean, clearly we could have had some people say, look, we will just kind of live under the radar here. We will not get legally married in this province, and therefore I will continue to get my benefits. These were people that were forthright and honest with their neighbors, and indeed with with this province. So therefore, that says more than I think a lot of our arguments ever say about the honesty and the integrity of these survivors, Mr. Speaker. You know, we've seen major changes since the early 90s in how we apportion benefits at WCB. We've seen major changes through major court actions. The Hayden decision, which is really one of the major seminal points of the 90s around workplace accident and how we're going to pay the workplace accident. It changed the insurance scheme from one of the old meat chart system to wage loss. And we've accepted that. And in the reality, we've seen the board, I think, take liberties with wage loss and how they portion out the amount of injury-related impairment and so on, Mr. Speaker. So we have those problems already. Then we kind of fast-forwarded here to the turn of this century with the chronic pain decision by the federal courts. And then we saw at that point the government of the day bring forth a bill that went to law amendments, but did not see the light of day again, Mr. Speaker, because they saw the error of its ways and how the board was trying to restrict its payments around chronic pain. But yet, if we listen to the minister today, the minister is asking us to put our whole faith in decisions made by the board. Now, one question could be asked, do I agree with the governance system of the board? I would wholeheartedly endorse the governance system of the board, but I don't wholeheartedly agree with the decision as it relates to the survivor benefits and the retroactivity aspect of it. So, Mr. Speaker, we have to ask ourselves, as a province, do we respect and owe these survivors the amount of WCB that they're looking for? And that would be prescribed in Bill 51. And I believe we do. We have to move this forward. We can, like $10 million, yes, is a lot of money. But it's like the red herring put forward by the minister when he said about the $80,000 payment. You know, that's money that's going to be amortized over a long period of time. So for him to say the amount of monies that they had garnered would be equal to that is not actually accurate because of amortization, Mr. Speaker, and therefore does not hold water as a monthly payment to these survivors. So, Speaker, that we've been fighting, I know since I've been in this House since '98, I've been a supporter of people like Betty Bauman and that who've been crusading for a bill like this that would not only reinstate them financially or reimburse them financially, but I think it's an argument around dignity now, Mr. Speaker, that these folks have fought the fight that they believe is right. They've been fought every step of the way by their government. So, Mr. Speaker, I believe that if we move forward on Bill 51 and mindful of the costs, realize that there's a finite number here that we have to deal with, and that the people of Nova Scotia realize that these folks have been put on enough and that we should pay them retroactively to the charter date. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I guess, you know, many times during my experience here in the legislature over the course of the last 8 years or so, when we come across a bill such as Bill number 51, it's not unusual to hear ministers stand up and say this is about fairness and this is about compassion. As the minister stated earlier in this debate, but he also stated at the same time, Mr. Speaker, that if he were in the shoes of the widows, he would feel the same way they do about this. He understands how they feel, and he would probably agree with them if he were in their shoes. But since he's the minister of this government, Mr. Speaker, he decides that fairness and compassion, as far as he's concerned, lie with the answer no. You're not getting the money that you deserve and that justly should be yours. Mr. Speaker, this is a matter, and I agree with the member for Cape Breton Centre, who rightfully stated that on several occasions, in two governments, there have been opportunities to correct the wrong, and there have been. This is a decision, a political decision, that has been, and what the politics and the legal aspect of this have not come together because the politicians have decided to lean on the legal decision that has been made as an excuse, and only an excuse. This could have been done back in 1999 when the then government of John Ham decided to further appeal it. They could have stopped it with a political decision at that time that said, yes, give them the money. It's as simple as that. By not appealing it, they would have stopped this whole thing. Now before I continue on this subject, let me give you an example, Mr. Speaker, of what I'm talking about. At that time, the majority government of John Ham was perhaps one of the nastiest governments in the history of Nova Scotia. And I'll give you an example. Mr. Speaker, because we're talking about, in this case, we're talking about a lot of the same people. The member for Cape Breton Centre made reference to an all-party select committee on workers' compensation. He was a member of that committee. The current Minister of Finance was a member of that committee. And they did, from what I've heard anyway, and from what I've read, a fairly decent job of going around the province and listening to people and coming up with a piece of legislation, or bits of the pieces of legislation anyway, which was a fairly decent job. But at that time, why I say the government was the nastiest government that I can recall anyway, was because the first thing they did as government, the first move they made was to stop charities in this province from getting money. Because they did away with the Charities Casino Act, the Sydney Charities Casino Act. And they took, and that's why to this very day, check the records, Mr. Speaker, to this very session, every session, I take great pride in reintroducing the Sydney Charities Casino Bill, which would reinstate the money taken from the casino in Sydney, would reinstate that a portion, a half of that profit of that casino would go towards charities. That was the first move that the Ham government did, the majority Ham government did, when it was elected in 1999, was to take money from charities and say, you can't have it any longer. So if you ask me, does it surprise me that they would not give money that rightfully belongs to widows? The answer is no, it doesn't surprise me at all. That's how that government at the time, that's how the government at the time worked. And Mr. Speaker, furthermore, the current Minister of Labour was a backbencher in that very government, the Ham government, and a fervent supporter of John Ham and any legislation that came forward from John Ham or any decision that came forward from the Ham government. So at that time, the minister certainly was in full agreement with whatever the Premier at the time, John Ham, did. And when John Ham decided that he's going to appeal this decision, that was a good decision for the widows, when he decided to appeal that, the current Minister of Labour, then a backbencher in the Ham government, was in full support of that. He had no problem backing that whatsoever, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, the minister says that the widows aren't satisfied. He knows that because the widows group, and I believe at the time when I last spoke with Betty Bauman, she called reference to her group as a Disenfranchised Widows Action Group, which I think in 4 words pretty well sums up everything there. But last time I met with her, she had certainly no intention of giving up anything. She's been phoning MLAs and visiting their offices and writing letters ever since I was first elected to this legislature, Mr. Speaker, and I can pretty well guarantee you that she'll be doing that until she finally gets what they justly deserve, or unless I can't see them giving up. Let me put it that way, Mr. Speaker. And as you know, what's happened here and what the widows had to face is that you get involved in court battles of this magnitude, and it can be very costly, but it can also be very trying. What the widows have gone through in the battles to date and in the years gone by have been more than any of us will ever go through, to start with. Mostly because most of us, to start with, we certainly haven't lost our spouses in industrial accidents. And Mr. Speaker, then to go through court battle after court battle after court battle, it can be pretty nasty, but it can be even more nasty when you're dragging vulnerable elderly widows through the court process and through the court system. And their lawyer at the time, a lawyer by the name of Scott Stearns, who represented the widows, made reference to that at that time, but he also made reference to, in an article that I read, he made reference to the fact that the government of the day said that it really, the argument that allowing the award to stand would pave the way for a flood of similar appeals. Mr. Stearns argued at that time that he thought about it, and he couldn't imagine any similar groups who would come forward under that type of circumstance, and who would that actually they were blazing a trail for this group of widows and that group of widows only. There would be no flood of appeals that would be made. It was a very weak argument that was being made on behalf of the government. So again, here we are in a current situation where now we have, as I understand the member for Kings West said, that we have about 50 widows who are left in this group. And as you can see, unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, you can see that time is taking its toll on the group. Now, I'm not saying, and I would not stand here and say that this certainly is what this government is hoping for, that eventually this will go away, because eventually there will no longer be any members in that group. But as time does go by, and the numbers dwindle, Mr. Speaker, you can see what the ultimate outcome would be. And $10 million is a lot of money in anybody's books, but I don't know how anybody could possibly put a price on the lives that have been lost over the years and of the struggles that the widows have endured. I don't know if you can put a price tag on that of 10 million or 110 million or 1 billion. I don't know. I wouldn't dare to put a price on it. $10 million, as I mentioned, is a lot of money, but it's money that the widows know that they are entitled to, that they've been fighting for some time. They've been fighting, a strong fight. Whether, as I said, they're visiting MLA's offices, or they're calling, or they're writing. They write letters to the editors in various newspapers across the province, and they look at similar legislation. They look in Ontario, where it didn't matter, in Ontario anyway, it didn't matter when any of the widows were remarried, at least not to the Ontario government. They decided to go ahead and went through with this. So in this province, Mr. Speaker, we have a history sometime under the current government of I think they've used it as an excuse, and they've used it to lean on sometimes, that they are compassionate. And I sometimes have a problem believing that, Mr. Speaker. If they are as compassionate and as fair as the Minister of Labour stated today, then I think there would be a lot more consideration given to this widows group and to bills such as Bill number 51. I'm glad, and there are a lot of widows from back home in Cape Breton who I've talked with over the years, who have said don't give up bringing this up for debate, and I know they won't, and I know that I won't, and I know that members such as the member for Cape Breton Centre won't stopping about it. He's been on his feet here on a constant basis talking about this, and I'm glad to see the member for Kings West bring forward the bill. But I guess I'm as frustrated as anybody else in seeing that it's not going to go anywhere. This is still a political decision. This is not a decision. Believe me, if the widows had had the money, they would have taken this battle to the Supreme Court of Canada. And not being a legal person myself, but as an outside observer, I'd say they'd have a pretty good chance of winning that battle in the Supreme Court of Canada. You can shake your head all you want. It's my belief that they would. It's my belief that they would. They won their first court battle, Mr. Speaker. Let's not forget that. They won the first court battle. They won the first court battle. And the appeal was made on the decision of then Premier John Hamm to go ahead. So it's not like they haven't won the battle before. They have, at the first stage. They didn't win the appeal, and if they had gone on further, again to the Supreme Court of Canada, then I think they would have had a great case to fight, and I think in the end they would have won their battle, and they would have been awarded their compensation, which they are duly entitled to, in my opinion. Mr. Speaker, again, this is a matter that boils down to a political decision. It still does. This is a political decision that can be made by this government. And to go back and look at the years 1985 to 1999 and allow compensation for that, as I said, I don't care whether it's $10 million, whatever the case may be, and I'm not being frivolous about spending $10 million. I know the government has to account for its money, but I also know that, in my opinion anyway, and the opinion of others, that those widows are entitled to that money regardless of what the amount is, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill 188?
Bill 188. The honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to stand today and speak on Bill 188. I may not be too pleased with what I'm going to speak about, but it's going to be spoken anyway, because we're talking about funerals here today. And I don't want to stand here and do a funeral sermon, but I probably could, because I've tended a lot of funerals in the past few years. I want to tell you a story that happened, and it'll come to a point. It may not seem like it's involved with this bill right now, but it will come to a point. I took one of my dogs named Jim to a veterinarian one day a few years back, and she had a sore on her belly, and the veterinarian put her out. He said he had to operate and put the dog to sleep first and do the operation. So he done that, and it was in the evening sometime, and for some reason, I don't know to this day why that dog died, but that dog did die. And about a day later, after he told us, he sent me a sympathy card in the mail. And I got the sympathy card and read it, and it was beautiful. It was just like, you know, it was just like it brought calm to me. But a few days later, I received this bill in the mail. And that didn't make me very calm, Mr. Speaker. It was a bill, you know, said he started the operation, but he had to bury that dog too. So that bill got paid. You know, I was reluctant to pay it. Had quite a little tax on it too, by the way. And so anyway, it'll come to the point in a minute. But first of all, I want to tell you, for the first year I was an MLA in Digby, Annapolis, I went to 103 funerals. 103. And I believe I go to that many pretty much every year. I've gone to 3 a day in that riding. And I send out sympathy cards, just like the doctor sent me, the veterinarian sent me for my dog. I send them to the people. And I thought, you know, I was doing a good thing, and probably I am doing a good thing by telling them people that I'm sorry, I'm a member of the government here, and I'll be to your funeral when I can be there, and I'll do all I can to you. So here about 3 months ago, Mr. Speaker, a man came into my office. And he came in and he said, Mr. Terrio, he just buried his wife, and he thanked me for the sympathy card. And he looked at me with tears in his eyes, and he said, it's a terrible thing to have to bury your wife. And, but he said, I don't know what hurt me the most, having to bury my wife or have to pay you, the government, taxes to do it. That's what he said to me, Mr. Speaker. And that hit me like a thunderbolt. This was a few months back. So after that, when I went to the funerals, I was feeling guilty. I didn't even want to send him a sympathy card after that. Because the guilt I was carrying as a member of the government, this man was making $800-some a month. That was his income. And the tax, he gave me the bill, give me the funeral bill, 60-some hundred, and the tax on this was $900. Now, I know what the 6,000 was for, 50-some hundred, cheapest funeral he could get, and they'd done a great service there. They'd done a lot of good things for him. But this bill, this tax of $900 didn't seem, you know, I was there as a government person for an hour to that funeral, but it didn't seem like this $900 was worth that. So I was feeling guilty, very, very guilty about, and I still am to this day. And that, Mr. Speaker, that's one of the reasons I brought this bill forward. I think this has been tried before. But taxes and death don't seem to be a good thing. This province and 4 other provinces in Atlantic Canada charge them on funerals, Quebec. The rest of Canada doesn't. I want to tell you another little story about taxes and death. My father died a young man, 57 years old. He worked hard all of his life. He brought up 9 children, never drew unemployment insurance in his life, and never asked for a penny from the government in his life. And he worked himself to death. That's what he done. He brought 9 of us up quite We had food, we had shelter. We never had to ask for any of that, that's for sure. Neither did my father. So 57 years old, he had a massive heart attack, out fishing, out trying to keep us going, just before Christmas, 1977. Never had much when he died, but we found $1,700 to bury him. We found it. I'm not sure where we found it, but we found it somewhere. At the end of that year, my father gets a tax bill in the mail. My mother gets a tax bill in the mail for $2,200 for money he had made the previous year. And he died at the first of lobster season when he would have made that money to pay that tax off. My mother never had enough money to pay this tax after we buried him. He had an old truck, 5-year-old truck that he just got paid for, and my mother had to sell. All he had was a half-ton truck. My mother had to sell this half-ton truck to pay this tax, income tax that was. But it's another point I'm trying to make. You know, your last year on life, you're on earth, you work all your life, you pay taxes in, and everybody pays taxes. We don't mind paying taxes. I don't mind paying taxes on a birth. Love to do it. Pay taxes on a car. Pay taxes on anything gives us comfort. Pay taxes, I'll pay taxes on fuel. I don't growl about that. But to pay a tax on getting dirt put on you to end your life, it's just not in my cards. And I don't think it's in 100% of the people's cards in this province, and I don't think it's in anyone's cards in this House to have to pay a death tax, because it gives a whole new meaning to the Grim Reaper. Quiet in here, but it's the truth. It's the truth. You can't. You just cannot, it's an immoral thing, and we've got to stop it. And I believe that we have to go after the federal government also. The federal government is prospering from this. There's other ways to get taxes. We are sending our water away, which is going to be going away more to other countries. Half the earth's drying up. That's going to be going out of here big time. We're sending our land away, for God's sake, free of charge. And we're going to be sending more of that away later on, free of charge. Why aren't we charging royalties on that? We're only talking about $4 million a year here to lift this provincial tax off of these funerals. What a great thing this government could do to help these people out. Down home, we have a funeral. We all take in sandwiches. We take in food of all kinds just to try to give them some kind of relief to that family. Anything we can do. Give them the shirt right off her back. So why can't this government give a little back to that greatest loss in that person's life, in that family's life? It would be the greatest thing that we could ever do. Our people work hard all their lives and pay taxes. Some never ask for a penny back. So the least we can do is show some compassion as a government, as a Canadian government, as a Canadian province, and give this back to the people. It's common sense to me. You know, it's just. And if we can't give it back to all, we could at least give it back to the people who have to sell their half-ton trucks or whatever's left over when one of the people die in the family. I mean, just to give that little bit back in this tax money, which don't mean anything, which we can get more, much more in other places. It would just be a great thing to do, Mr. Speaker. And I hope and pray that this government really takes this seriously, and I hope that this government will help us go to the federal government to do the same thing, because it's the right thing to do. And with that, I'll take my seat. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise today to speak to private members Bill 188, which relates to rebating the provincial portion of the HST on funeral services. Let me say that I agree with the member from Digby Annapolis, and when he says that as an MLA, you become very conscious of the cost of funeral services, indeed the cost of food or the cost of anything, because as an MLA we are a sounding board and sometimes a source of advice for many people who find taxes of any type burdensome and have difficulty meeting the costs of living, not to mention the sometimes referred to as the high cost of dying. So as MLAs, everyone in this House, I think, understands and appreciates that the funeral for anybody, in particular a loved one, is not easy. And we also know that funeral services can be costly and do, in some cases, serve to add a great deal to a family's burden at a very difficult time. However, Mr. Speaker, despite the fact what we as MLAs may feel and run into in our constituencies and our day-to-day activities to support our constituents, as a government, we would be remiss to consider rebating the provincial portion of the HST on funeral services without first balancing this cost against other funding priorities. There are many funding priorities in this province, and as a government, we must consider them all. And in fact, the consideration of what are the priorities for Nova Scotians is what the budget process is all about. It's during the budget process where government carefully examines and reviews the multiple programs and services that we would like to fund, that people would like to see funded, and of course, that Nova Scotians would like us to fund. But we must then prioritize them in line with the amount of provincial revenues which are available to us. Now, I want to tell you, Mr. Speaker, having been through, I think, 9 or 10 budget processes, that this is no easy feat. Inevitably and invariably, this process has us leaving some very good initiatives unfunded, simply because government cannot afford to live beyond its means. And I want to tell you, Mr. Speaker, that this year's budget process was no different. Indeed, I guess an aside comment that this year's budget process was the most difficult one that we have gone through for quite some number of years. We had to make tough choices and to make funding decisions based upon what we could afford. One of the things that made this year's budget process as difficult as it did is for the past 2 or 3 years, things were particularly good in terms of revenue for Nova Scotia and for Nova Scotians. Therefore, in those 2 or 3 years, that we were able to do things that had not been done in previous years. And of course, in any decision, as all members of this House will know, that people remember the good times, they don't remember the bad times. And Mr. Speaker, the standard is raised, and when the revenues are not as good as they had been, we did some just remarkably positive things over the past 2 or 3 years. And I know that the leader of the official opposition, he would have to agree, and as much as he and his colleagues are going to agree, that despite some challenging times, this year's budget was a good budget for Nova Scotians, and I'm quite confident that they will be supporting it. Bill 188 proposes the implementation of a rebate program similar to your energy rebate for the provincial portion of the HST relating to funeral services. Now, this would see the rebate being delivered at the point of sale by funeral homes, with the province reimbursing the funeral homes for the cost. Mr. Speaker, as members of this House will know from the documents tabled by the Finance Minister, this year's plan does not include a rebate of the provincial portion of the HST on funeral services. The Harmonized Sales Tax, or HST, is a value-added tax that applies to most consumer purchases in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland and Labrador. In fact, it is one of the very major revenue sources for the province. The HST was adopted about 10 years ago as a more efficient and transparent way to raise taxes, and I believe, I guess it would be under the Liberal government that the decision to accept the HST here in Nova Scotia was made. And what the change saw was the provincial sales tax blended with the federal GST, which resulted in the provincial tax amount being reduced. This is the provincial portion, the provincial PST, being reduced from 11% to 8%. Now, Mr. Speaker, the HST allows for a lower rate overall than separate taxes in those years, the PST and the GST. And of course, in order to afford a lower rate, the HST has a broader base, which means that that tax was applied to more goods and services than under the old tax structure. Previously, some goods and services were taxed at higher rates and others not at all. For example, if my memory serves me correct, Mr. Speaker, child's clothing was exempted at that time, but the compromise to get a lower rate for many other products that the HST was applied to clothing, children's clothing. In Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, most of the goods and services that are sold and delivered are subject to the HST. Now, this was a conscious decision by the governments of that day to keep the overall tax structure as low as possible. And because of this, Mr. Speaker, we must take the time to carefully consider any rebate of the provincial portion of this tax to ensure that both our tax structure and our revenue source are not compromised. This is what was done prior to implementing your energy rebate. This program offers a point-of-sale rebate of the provincial portion of the HFT from household energy. And this was done to combat the effects of dramatically increasing energy costs. Mr. Speaker, some may ask why we just can't do the same thing here and give people a break on funeral taxes. Mr. Speaker, this is not a simple decision to make. There are many other factors to be considered. First thing is, as I've said, it's not budgeted this year. And implementing such a program would cost the province about $4 million in revenue. And we'd need to find that money elsewhere in order to meet our existing balanced budget and debt management commitments and to continue to offer the same level of programs and services. And we have to also consider the administrative challenges of putting such a program in place. The administration of such a program would be expected to cost between $500,000 and $600,000, as there's no current structure in place to facilitate the process. And Mr. Speaker, of course, this is another expense that's not budgeted for. As well, time would be needed to make sure that any program put in place would target those that need the help the most. And as I stated earlier, we know that funeral expenses certainly add to the burden of families already facing enormous pressure. As a government, however, we must take the time to look at all funding needs to ensure that we make the right decision for the greatest benefit to Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, we must balance our priorities against our revenues. This has been a trademark, and indeed, it's going to be a legacy of this government. We must be fiscally responsible. Now, Mr. Speaker, as all members of this House know, there are many worthwhile initiatives that come forth every day for funding consideration. And, Mr. Speaker, one would only have to tune in to question period that occurs here 3 days a week to see the questions put forth by the opposition, and it isn't very often that one of those questions does not carry with it a price tag. Mr. Speaker, many of those things are priorities for us all if we have, if we had the money. A lot of these suggestions that are made by the opposition in question day, such as the member from Digby-Annapolis and his colleague, the member from Kings West, who stood up and talked about the Catholic Women's League resolution yesterday or the day before, supporting the very thing that the member from Digby-Annapolis is saying. We think that that is not a bad suggestion. We don't discard that out of hand as a government. What I'm saying is that we have many priorities, and any suggestion, such as that one, has to be considered for funding against all of these other very worthwhile initiatives. For example, the member from Halifax Fairview for many times has waxed on about ambulance fees are too high. So do we increase ambulance fees at the expense of rebating
Order,
the funeral
please.
fees? Anyway.
Order, please. Order. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is indeed a pleasure to join this evening on the debate on Bill 188. Let me begin by saying that I always enjoy listening to the member for Digby-Annapolis. He always, whenever he speaks on matters before the House, I always find that the sincerity with which he approaches these things is unmistakable to anyone who listens to what he has to say. So I very much appreciate the fact that that he has brought forward this issue. It's obviously one that he cares about. It's obviously one that he has seen in his constituency, as I have seen in mine, affect people, and I think we all have. And in fact, the story that he tells about the constituent coming to him, I'm not sure I ever heard anyone say I couldn't decide what hurt me worse, paying the tax or the death of my wife. But I understand what he means, and what he's meaning is that this compounds the grief. I mean, he's in a state of a heightened sense of grief, and so things that are unfair to him seem so much more unfair than I suppose if you were thinking about it in an abstract way. I assume that that's what the fellow was talking about, and I appreciate that. I've heard this in my own constituency, and I know that the member for Digby-Annapolis wasn't in this chamber. And neither was I when the harmonized sales tax was brought forward. But it was brought forward as a Liberal initiative by the provincial Liberal government in the days of Savage. And it was signed off on, I can still remember seeing the bill, it was signed off on by the two finance ministers who at the time were, people may remember, Bernie Boudreau and Paul Martin. And those were the architects of the harmonized sales tax agreement at the time, and they decided that they were going to cast the net as broad as they could in order to capture as much tax revenue, and the excuse that was given was that by broadly casting the net, it meant that the overall rate would be lower. Well, and it was also, by the way, trumpeted across the province as being revenue neutral. Now, I didn't know very many people out there who believed either of those things, that the tax rate was going to be lower or that it was going to be revenue neutral at the time. But that was the decision of the Liberal government of the day, and it's not like these things were not brought to their attention. They were brought to their attention at the time. And I remember there was a point where the Premier of the day said there was one item on which he would not budge. There was one item of principle on which he would not budge, and that was books. And books. Books. And in fact, in this province today, you don't pay the HST, the harmonized sales tax, on books. Now, there's actually a rebate system that's in place to deal with that. But that was a point on which the Premier of the day decided that he was going to draw a line. Now, I never know in these ones, because I know the time is limited, which rabbit tracks to follow and which ones you shouldn't follow. But the one that I want to just go down for a second is the idea that this was a budget of difficult choices by the government. Look, this is a budget that included almost $500,000 in new revenue. I mean, $500 million in new revenue. I mean, this was not a tough choice budget. This was about the options that they were going to pursue, and they laid out the budget in that fashion. It was not the hard times budget that was aimed at somehow, a staggering debt in the province that had to be, a deficit rather in the province that had to be dealt with from year to year. This was, in all things considered, a good revenue budget for the province. So I mean, this is part of the fantasy that goes on around this budget, is the notion that this was somehow about tough choices. It wasn't. What's interesting, and I find really interesting about this particular subject, the one that my colleague from Digby Annapolis has raised, is that it is in fact an item that we in the New Democratic Party have raised on any number of occasions with respect to the tax on funerals. And in fact, in 2003, we set out our campaign, and our campaign was called 7 Key Commitments, and one of the commitments was taking the HST off of the necessities of life. Now, what everybody understood at the time, and the thing that everybody remembers, of course, is the energy tax rebate that this government ultimately ended up adopting as part of their platform in 2006, and in the last budget implementing in this province. That's the one that everybody remembers. But at the time, what we set out in our platform in 2003 as examples of unfair taxation was things like the HST on funerals, things like over-the-counter children's medication, which ought not to be taxed. We talked about the taxes on home care fees. You have somebody coming into your home care services rather. So having somebody come into your home to assist you with nursing services is taxed. And we said that there are some of these items that it's not on the basis, as the minister likes to allege. I mean, the minister here alleged that the reason why the tax was taken off of energy was because of dramatically rising energy costs. And maybe that's the reason they did it. But that was not the reason that we ever proposed it. The reason why we proposed it was because it was an unfair tax. You ought not, there are some things like being able to heat your home that you just shouldn't tax. That it should be absent the government's ability to tax those things which are fundamental to the nature of living in this province, and for that matter, of dying in this province, like funerals that the member for Digby Annapolis has pointed out. So I agree with him that this should not happen. And the minister says, well, this is all part of the HST agreement. And I want the member from Digby Annapolis to know that we've heard this all before. We heard this in 2003. We heard this in 2006. It just can't be done. That's what we were told. That's what we were told about the energy tax rebate. It can't be done. Well, you know something? The HST legislation has now been in place in this province for more than a decade. Are you trying to tell me that the HST legislation, I know members across have heard this before, they try to tell you that the HST legislation is harder to amend than the 10 Commandments. That's what they try to tell you. It's impossible. This piece of legislation is somehow immutable. There's no way that you can change the HST agreement. Well, this is nonsense, Mr. Speaker. It's a piece of legislation, which of course, if you wanted to, you could renegotiate. And of course, we want a uniform tax in the province. And in fact, the unitary tax is a good idea. You don't want to cause more paperwork for business people, but you can have a unitary tax and you can have a fair unitary tax. And that's what I think we're all engaged in, is trying to decide with respect to the people of the province, what is fair taxation and what is unfair taxation? Well, taxing funerals is unfair. We agree, Mr. Speaker. So, you know, I don't believe that it's as simple as the government tries to lay out here this evening, that they simply say that this is about balancing off the priorities in the bigger picture around the cost of this. The first thing you should know is that in every instance where they have told us that the program that we have proposed is going to cost X number of dollars, it has always cost something dramatically less than that, because the government overstates what they believe the cost is going to be to the government, and this is the way that they go about trying to defend their decision not to implement a particular piece of tax fairness legislation. And you know, I was amused on another point on this too, because my colleague also talked about a death tax, and this is a death tax. But there are other death taxes in this province. For example, something that people may not know is that a few years ago in this province, we moved to switch probate fees over to taxes. And this was a specific change that was made in respect to a case that went through the Supreme Court in which they decided that these probate fees were not, in fact, connected to the actual service that was being provided, and in fact that they were taxes. If they didn't bring in the legislation to make them taxes, they were not going to be allowed to collect the fees. And what's interesting about it, most people don't know this, it's actually an inheritance tax or a death tax that is connected to the value of the estate. The higher the value of the estate that comes before the probate court, the higher the fees. So it is exactly, ironically, the kind of inheritance tax that you frequently see in other jurisdictions. And that was done here. It was done by this government, and it went seemingly unnoticed by the people of the province. But we have what is, in essence, an inheritance tax in this province as well. Let me just end by saying this. The bill that the member for Digby Annapolis has brought forward is, and I don't know the technical aspects of the bill, but I am assuming if he's taken it through Ledge Council that it's drafted effectively. But it is the right kind of bill because it sends the right kind of message. It's about fairness. It's about treating your citizen fairly, and they have the right to expect that from their government. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and certainly pleased to be part of the debate tonight on Bill 188. I think this is a good bill. It's a timely bill, and it's one that I think when the member from Digby Annapolis brought it forth, you know, he brought it forth in that in the spirit of what really we as MLAs should be doing, and that's responding to real needs, needs that come to our office that are very challenging, very difficult to find immediate solutions to. And this was one of those, you know, issues of the heart that I think all of us as MLAs and really as Nova Scotians certainly feel very strongly that we should be doing something about. So I think this bill, you know, may not move forward today, But I certainly hope that in the context of minority government, that all parties can work together and strive to eliminate the tax on funerals, which is what the bill is calling for. It may very well have to be done, need to be done by a rebate system, and certainly that measure can indeed be put in place. Certainly over the years as an MLA, and for me it's about 3.5 to 4 years, and this is an issue that certainly I've been called on. People have come to my office wondering, are there programs that are available to help somebody who is not of financial means to handle the full cost of a funeral. And we know today that a basic funeral is about $6,500. Perhaps cremation may be less expensive, but nevertheless, that part of the bill, that tax part, really does stand out. And I feel that it's one that we should be working to address. Interestingly enough, the day that the member from Digby-Annapolis raised it in our caucus, and it's not the first time that it certainly was raised, but right around the same time, the CWL, the Catholic Women's League here in Nova Scotia, have made that part of one of their petitions currently to put pressure, in this case on the Harper government, to remove the GST, that federal tax which came into place in 1991. And there are some services that are not included in the GST, and certainly I think along with us working on the provincial part, we certainly, I think, should support the Catholic Women's League in their initiative. However, that being said, yesterday I entered a resolution here in the House in support of the Catholic Women's League, and I was surprised that the government decided not to support it. The operative clause spoke about asking the Harper government to review, simply to review. I never asked them to immediately do away with the tax on funerals, the GST on funerals, but to actually go through a review process. So I certainly plan to send that resolution to the Catholic Women's League here in Nova Scotia, and hopefully they'll disseminate that resolution, not supported by government, to all the parishes across Nova Scotia. And I think that's the kind of action and reaction that we need to, I think, get something done here. Certainly, for the federal government to take the GST off is a good time. The federal coffers, the federal treasury, is now annually coming up with the largest surpluses in the history of the country, and taking measures to deal with issues like this, I think, are ones that simply should be done. It's in my view a good bill, or the right bill, and a just cause that we need to be picking up. There has been a national petition on the go for this removal of the tax, and I'm not sure where it is in terms of presentation to Parliament, but hopefully we can get some more, I guess, drive and energy behind this effort. And at the federal level, I know my colleague from Digby-Annapolis has heard from a few MPs that are certainly willing at the federal level to make every effort to bring this issue back on the table. So I think supporting a national petition, the CWL effort, is one that we certainly should be doing. I think all of us have, come across the 85-year-old gentleman that went into the member from Digby Annapolis's office. It wasn't too long ago that a man by the name of Carl Hicks sat down in my office, and like the gentleman from Digby, he had lost his wife of 40-something years. She had been on oxygen for about 7 or 8 years. It wasn't a complete surprise, but her passing was devastating to him, his life companion. And when he came to my office, it was to find out, if community services gave some help to funeral expenses. And of course, when he got the bill, again, not realizing that there is a provincial tax, there is a GST tax on funerals, that certainly really caught him off guard. And it was going to be an additional several months from his senior's pension to pay off the funeral that were now being added on, because he could not go out. He hadn't been in a financial position to pay in advance for his or his wife's funeral. So now it was going to be a matter of months and several years to make payments on the funeral costs. So wouldn't it be a wonderful initiative for us in this province as legislators to find the revenue to help the Carl Hickses of this province deal with funeral costs. And funerals are expensive and becoming more expensive all the time. That is simply just one of the realities. Maybe government sees it as a one-time expense, which it obviously is, and therefore collecting the one-time tax is something maybe they will try to hold on to for some time. But it is certainly my hope and the work now of our caucus to certainly make it an issue, keep it on the burner, and as the AVR commentator in the Valley today, Dave Chalk, when he did his editorial, he said, the member from Digby Annapolis has raised a great issue, and now he's responsible for it, that he's put it out on the table. And there's one thing that I can guarantee this House, and that is the member from Digby Annapolis will not let go of this. He will drive this issue, and for him and for our caucus, we will certainly pick it up. There are many cases too, in our province where, the only two to deal with the funeral expense is the husband looking after a wife or the wife after a husband. There are many who don't have extended family that can come and help out with financial assistance. We are a province that have the second oldest population in the country. And so with that many people over the age of 65, what an additional hardship when we do place a tax on the funeral of a loved one. And certainly those people on seniors' pension, as I've mentioned here in reference to Carl Hicks, these are the people that will use monthly installments to pay for a funeral. And so with the number of seniors that we have in this province who will have a wife burying a husband or a husband or wife, it's certainly a time that we take this issue very, very serious, and certainly it's one that our caucus will continue to drive over the coming weeks and months. And certainly it's a bill that speaks to the very heart of what fairness should be. This is one which is for the common good of Nova Scotians. and whatever part of Canada and whatever provinces that still do tax funerals. Certainly, I think we hope to raise the consciousness to the national level, join the petition that is currently going on, support the MPs that are getting out on this issue. And so I will just end my time here today on this issue with certainly a personal pledge to join the CWL, members of the House, members of the Nova Scotia population, the people of the province who want to make a change here that will be for the better and certainly alleviate one of those costs at a time and point in life that are dealing with the most difficult situation they have to face. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The time for debate has expired. The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that completes the Liberal Party's business for today. I would now ask the Deputy House Leader of the Government to give us the rest of the business for this evening. Thank you.
The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to call private members' public bills for second reading.
Private members' public bills for second reading.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to call Bill 170, Provincial Parks Act.
Bill 170. The Honourable